which, in a lecture ostensibly about psychopaths, is a strangely psychopathic way to talk. Elsewhere, Kilanani used her talk to warn of the costs of talking to white people at all. She said that it was the cost of your own life as they suck you dry. There are no good apples out there. She described white people as a demented, violent predator with holes in their brain, and said that all white people are out of their minds, and they have been for a long time. And she declared that talking to white people about race is useless, which must be why resorts to violence were so common in her talk. But Kilanani is not alone. Only a week before she gave her speech at Yale, another psychoanalyst named Donald Moss published an academic article titled On Having Whiteness, based on a set of his seminars. Describing whiteness as a parasitic-like condition, he also toyed playfully with some sort of permanent cure for the problem. There is not yet a permanent cure, he warned, though doubtless, in the years to come, there will be many people eager to pick up the challenge of thinking about that one. Interlude. China. Most people around the world want to think well of themselves and of the country they are born into. Most do not think it a good idea to wage a remorseless, demoralizing war against everything to do with the majority group in their society. They do not pick up questionable terms invented yesterday and try to roll them out across the entire country, using them to explain each and every problem in the society. These and many more are symptoms of a very Western disease, a disease of self-hatred and self-distrust, and a disease that is, in both senses of the term, a type of self-abuse, one which other powers outside the West are more than happy to observe and use for their own ends. A characteristic example of this was given in 2008 when the pop star Damon Albarn gave an interview to the journalist Brian Appleyard. The former Blur frontman was doing a lot of work in China and was impatient with criticism of the country. "We've got to get over thinking we have the moral high ground," he told Appleyard, "because I just don't think we do." Albarn claimed to have read about the Opium Wars and appeared to believe that every criticism made of modern China could be traced to Western meddling in the country. His interviewer asked him a pertinent question. If all the problems of China could be traced to the Opium Wars, what were we to make of Chairman Mao's killing of perhaps 70 million of his own people? This puts the Opium Wars into the shade, does it not? Albarn, who is admittedly not one of our smartest minds, seemed stumped. "Well," he said, "there is also the argument that something like 400 million people were taken out of extreme poverty." The truth is that unless he could blame the West, Albarn, like so many other cultural and other figures in the West, was stumped to find any explanation for malfeasance in the world. So long as there was a story of Western wrongdoing, that story could suffice to be the founding problem of the country in question. There are several problems with this reflex anti-Westernism. One is that it ignores what is actually going on in the world today. For instance, almost every anti-Westernist knows that some people from the West were engaged in selling opium to the Chinese in the 19th century. But how many of them know that it is synthetic opioids from China that are now decimating swaths of the United States? According to the U.S. National Center for Health Statistics, More than 500,000 people in America have died in America's opioid pandemic in the last 2 decades. The Chinese authorities know of this drug production and do little or nothing to halt it. Among these drugs is fentanyl, the addictive properties and devastating effects of which are known across the country. George Floyd himself had fentanyl in his system when he died, which does not remotely excuse the actions of the arresting officers, but Floyd was just one of hundreds of thousands of Americans hooked on this Chinese drug. In the same year he died, 93,000 Americans died from fentanyl. Are very many people in America aware of this? Are many people in the wider West or the wider world? If they are not aware, then it is in part because people have been persuaded that picking over a select group of historical wrongs will help solve problems in their societies today. Whereas the truth is that a better understanding of the issues facing our societies today is a more likely way to help solve those issues. If more people knew about China's present-day opioid war in America, then perhaps lives could be saved. And not just in America. Scotland alone today currently has an opioid death rate almost 13 times higher than the European average. That is a real-life tragedy. But raking over the past and judging it as harshly as possible seems to be so much easier than doing anything practical about problems that face us all today. All of this is a very unusual game to be playing. No societies outside the West are engaged in the same self-scouring enterprise. What is the rest of the world doing, while the West, with America leading the way, engages in this orgy of self-abuse? The country that is now the only major challenger to America as the world's leading economy is the People's Republic of China, a country which, as is the way with countries with such titles, is not a republic and does not belong to the people. The People's Republic of China has been ruled for over 7 decades by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. Unlike all the other major powers that tried communism, China is still pursuing a version of that ideology. Unlike them, it has found a way to liberalize its financial system to such an extent that in recent decades it has become the world's second most important economy. While the Chinese GDP has soared, the party elites who run the country have known not to make the same mistake as those of other socialist countries. The CCP has been very careful to keep a rein on any political liberalism, even as it allows a degree of tightly state-controlled economic liberalism. The current president, Xi Jinping, has accelerated this ever since coming to power in 2013. That year, he launched a campaign to prevent liberal ideologies entering the public discourse in China. In the name of security, he also introduced a system of re-education of ethnic and religious minorities, who the party see as an ideological or security threat. To date, more than 1 million men, women and children of the Uyghur Muslim minority, among others, have been forced into the sprawling network of internment camps, often referred to as concentration camps, across the Xinjiang region. These camps include systematic rape and torture of detainees, as well as forced sterilization of Uyghur women. There are also accusations of the forced harvesting of the internal organs of detainees in these and other camps in the Chinese system. The regime tends to dismiss all such reports, but there is nothing surprising about them. The CCP has always denied any and every accusation of human rights assaults within the country. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to interview Chen Guangcheng, the blind Chinese activist who had caused an international incident by claiming political asylum at the American embassy in Beijing. Wang Cheng had come to the attention of the authorities because of his human rights work inside China. He and his family had suffered years of official intimidation, surveillance, and physical abuse. As he said back in 2013, the situation inside China is far worse than the ordinary Briton or the international community has been told by the Chinese propaganda. He had come to realize this when he became aware of the grim realities of the CCP's infamous one-child policy. After trying to take a petition to the central government and one to the local government, he realized that one of the great cop-outs of communist belief was wrong. It wasn't that the local guys were bad guys and the central government were good guys. The system was rotten throughout. He could not persuade that system to change in spite of the wealth of evidence he collected against it of women who were found to have had a second pregnancy being dragged away and having their baby forcefully aborted. When the authorities found out that a woman was going to give birth to a second child, there were a number of things they could do. If the mother tried to go into hiding, then the authorities would capture all her family members and imprison them for weeks or months until this forced the mother out of hiding. Then the returning pregnant mother could be forced to have an abortion. What does this mean, to carry out a forced abortion at 9 months? Wang Cheng explained. First of all, the woman is dragged to the hospital and forced to sign a consent form for an abortion. There are several ways. One way is that they force the baby to be induced, born. Usually the baby is born alive, and then they would throw the baby into water and drown it. The second way is they have some sort of liquid poison dosage, and they directly inject the needle into the head of the baby and kill the baby directly and let the baby come out. It is a practice, as he said, that happened everywhere, all over China. A system of family planning by violence. The long-term effects of this, as he saw it, were the bankruptcy of the culture of respect for human life. People do not respect life anymore. After causing untold misery, the one-child policy was phased out during Xi's reign. But the camp system in Xinjiang, among much else, shows that human rights have no more purchase in China in this decade than they had in the decades before. If anything, the ability of the CCP to crack down on human rights, whether in Hong Kong or elsewhere, has increased as its unofficial empire has grown. Because, while pursuing its hybrid form of communist capitalism, the CCP has managed to purchase greater influence and respectability across the world. The elites of America and Europe thought that bringing China into international organizations would push democratic norms into the country. Instead, China has pushed democratic norms out of international organizations. It has used the period since its 2001 entry into the World Trade Organization to especially great effect. In the year 2000, most countries in South America, Africa, the Far East and Australasia and Europe did more trade with America than they did with China. By 2020, that situation was inverted. In just 20 years, all these parts of the globe were doing more business with China than they were with America. During that period, America had fallen from more than 75% of total global trade to just over 25%. And eating up all that difference was China, which went rocketing up in exactly the opposite direction. The country's Belt and Road Initiative seeks to form a network of Chinese infrastructure and investment that covers the globe, an empire in all but name. It has already seen the country buy its way across the Far East, Near East and Africa, It has also chosen to buy up key infrastructure across the West. Sometimes it is a key port, such as that of Haifa in Israel or that of Piraeus in Greece. In 2019, Italy signed a deal with China to become the first G7 country to be a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. This allows China's communications and construction company to access the Italian port of Trieste and develop the port at Genoa. It will also include Chinese entry into Italy's agricultural, financial, energy and engineering markets. These countries are not alone. The UK government gave the Chinese the go-ahead to build and maintain a new nuclear reactor in England. And, before a swift reversal, China's government-backed communications firm Huawei was briefly tasked with helping to create the UK's new 5G network. Of course, no country could carry out such a swift global expansion without a key ingredient, and that is elite capture. The CCP's ability to buy up influence among the elites in each of the countries the party is hoping to enter is unparalleled in its scope and munificence. Across the countries of the West, all who have been in need of some post-retirement financing, from former prime ministers on down, have found comfortable sinecures thanks to Chinese firms. Even among the relatively lower ranks of political figures in the West, the CCP and its fronts have been busy buying people up. The Liberal Democrats were the junior partner in the coalition government in Britain between 2010 and 2015. But since leaving office, its senior and junior figures have been hoovered up by Beijing. The party's present leader took funding for his leadership campaign of the Liberal Democrats from Huawei board member Sir Michael Rake. Ryan Kotzek, the former head of strategy for then-leader Nick Clegg, ended up joining a PR firm that tried to launder China's international image while it was snuffing out democracy in Hong Kong. And former Treasury Secretary Danny Alexander, who helped the UK become the first Western country to join China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, joined the bank after leaving government, helping to front the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative. Similar stories have occurred across Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and all other parts of a once solid Western alliance. As Clive Hamilton and Marika Olberg describe in their book on the subject, Hidden Hand, major financial institutions, among others, in the West, have competed with each other for the CCP's favours, often in the most corrupt and flagrant ways. For instance, in the 2000s, Deutsche Bank used bribes and other corrupt practices to gain entry to the Chinese market. And in 2009, the bank beat JP Morgan to a deal because it had been actively hiring CCP princelings. Among those who the bank had employed was Wang Zhisha, the daughter of the current vice premier and member of the Politburo Standing Committee, Wang Yang. Across the West, the same story has unfolded. From New Zealand to Washington, D.C., the CCP has been buying up influence, both big and small. From making massive infrastructure investments to arranging for the government-run Bank of China to become the largest single shareholder in BHR Partners, set up by Hunter Biden and John Kerry's stepson after Hunter accompanied his father on an official trip to Beijing in 2013. China has also bought its way into elite institutions across the West. Ancient universities, including Britain's Cambridge University, have welcomed Chinese investment and allowed Chinese authorities the right to decide what should and should not be studied or said in the institutions, and to suppress criticism of the munificent regime that is paying the checks. Always, the country has used its growing financial clout to flex its diplomatic muscles. Early in his time as Prime Minister in 2012, David Cameron met the Dalai Lama while the Buddhist leader was on a trip to London. Because the CCP has a disagreement with the Dalai Lama over the issue of Tibet, they responded swiftly to news of the meeting. The British ambassador to China was immediately called into a meeting and given a telling off. In the wake of the incident, the CCP announced that relations with the United Kingdom had been severely damaged. Sure enough, Chinese investment there was put on hold. A trip to the United Kingdom by Chairman Wu Bangkuo was called off, and the CCP talked about how hurt the Chinese people had been by the meeting. The British Prime Minister was understandably spooked, and soon afterward announced that he planned never to meet the Dalai Lama again. The British government then issued a formal apology to the Chinese authorities for the offence caused. Normal trade relations were eventually restored, but what struck me most about the affair was an account I was subsequently given of the first meeting between British and Chinese officials after this affair. I was told by a source who had been at the meeting that before the meeting had got underway, the CCP officials pushed a copy of the British apology across the table toward their British counterparts, who were then asked to stand up and read it aloud, which they duly did. Sitting down afterward, the lead Chinese official reportedly smiled and said, "We just wanted to know you meant it." David Cameron certainly learned his lesson, and seemed to have discovered where the money and power now lay. A year after leaving office, it was announced that he was taking a leadership role in a new $1 billion investment fund set up to promote and back China's Belt and Road Initiative. A former British Prime Minister was helping China to develop its empire. Similar stories can be found everywhere in financial and political circles in the West. A couple of years ago, one of the foremost financial authorities in America was trying to persuade an acquaintance to invest in Chinese infrastructure projects. The businessman expressed doubts about the moral efficacy of investing in CCP projects and was told by his American counterpart, "They have already won. I'm just trying to put you on the right side of the ledger." So China, at any rate, has not wasted the past 2 decades. It has expanded more than it has managed to expand at any previous point in its history. And if there is going to be any country that overtakes the United States as the global superpower in the century ahead, then China is the only contender. You might have thought, given that competition, that people might have paid some attention to the most basic of comparisons. If the American-led world order is so terrible, what might a CCP-led world order look like? If the United States and other Western countries are so dreadful, then would the only likely alternative system be any better? The question might soon be answered for us. China today has a population 4 or 5 times the size of that of the United States. It has an economy that prominent figures such as Elon Musk have predicted could reach 2 or 3 times the size of the US economy in the very near future. And that is while still expecting GDP per capita in China to be much less than that within the United States. It would only require GDP per capita in China to reach half of that within the United States for the Chinese economy to be twice that of the United States. So the question, compared to what, might have been a relevant one to have asked in the West in recent decades. Yet very few people asked it. One of the few who did was a late colleague of mine, Clarissa Tan, who wrote in 2014 about the issue of Chinese racism. Although ethnically Chinese, Clarissa had lived for a time in Singapore. As she herself said, there she had been a banana, which is to say that she was yellow on the outside but white on the inside. That is, someone who looks ethnically Chinese but whose thinking was regarded as Western. As she pointed out, Asia is filled with labels like this, where people are summed up along ethnic lines in ways that are rarely flattering. The terms that are reserved for foreigners, and white people in particular, are especially ugly. They include Farang in Thailand, Gaijing in Japan, Matsale in Malaysia, Guelo in Hong Kong. This last one is particularly interesting. Quay means ghost, and it is meant literally. A white person is not fully human. Indeed, in many Chinese dialects, the idiomatic term for any foreigner, be they Indian or Ivorian or Irish, contains the ghostly Quay. Only ethnic Chinese are constantly referred to as Ren, which means person. In other words, only the Chinese really exist as full-blooded people. Nor does Chinese society have any of the Western desire to avoid racialized language. Racism against black people remains ingrained and commonplace. And like anywhere, the racism in the present comes from a racist past. One of the most significant reformers in early 20th century China, Kang Youwei, once argued that there should be medals called Improver of the Race medals. These would be given to white people or yellow people who were willing to marry black people. In time, Youwei believed that this would purify mankind. Meanwhile, those who were willing to take the hit should be honoured. If the racism shown to Africans in Africa by their new Chinese masters has roots, they are roots that go back a long way. Yet, for some reason, all this is counted up on an entirely different side of the ledger, a fact that suits the CCP enormously well. At the same time that the CCP has been actively engaging in the most appalling human rights abuses, it is clearly delighted that the West has distracted itself with a set of self-abasements of its own. So long as the West is into the masochism business, it will always find a very willing sadist in Beijing. On the national and international stage, China is willing to hit the West, and America in particular, in what it regards as its weak spot. And one of those weak spots is racism. Consider what happened just weeks into the Biden administration in 2021. America's newly appointed ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, spoke at the UN General Assembly commemorative meeting for the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. On that occasion, Thomas-Greenfield told the General Assembly that growing up in America, she had lived racism, experienced racism, and survived racism. She told the UN General Assembly that America had an original sin, and that this sin was slavery. Among other deaths, the US ambassador talked of the senseless killing of George Floyd. She spoke of the justice of the BLM movement and of the importance of dismantling white supremacy. She also spoke about the spike in hate crimes over the past 3 years. The latest example of this horror, she told the Assembly, was the mass shooting in Atlanta. It is worth noting that at the time Thomas Greenfield said this to the UN, there was no evidence that the Atlanta Spa shooting, in which 8 people, including 6 Asian women, had been killed, had any racial component. The suspect being held in custody had previously spent time in a clinic where he was treated for sex addiction, and he later claimed that he did not do it for race-related reasons. But the UN General Assembly was left with the clear impression that this was yet another mass racist shooting in the USA. Not content with being racist against the black population, the US citizenry was now also turning on Asian Americans. Another month later, and Thomas Greenfield was addressing Al Sharpton's National Action Network. There she reminisced fondly about her speech at the UN General Assembly and said that she had wanted to show the UN that she had personally experienced one of America's greatest imperfections. She continued, "I've seen for myself how the original sin of slavery weaved white supremacy into our founding documents and principles." She also told of her pride at the new administration's decision to seek readmission to the UN Human Rights Council, saying that doing so would advance America's values. But she knew the limits of this approach. Of course, when we raise issues of equity and justice at the global scale, we have to approach them with humility. We have to acknowledge that we are an imperfect union and have been since the beginning. She told conference attendees that America had to do the work, such as not forgetting our past or ignoring our present. But it was not clear that America's rivals at the UN shared any of Ambassador Thomas Greenfield's strategic or moral outlook. Towards the end of her UN speech, she had briefly paused from her litany of American racism to acknowledge that in Myanmar the Rohingya have been oppressed, abused, and killed in staggering numbers. And she noted that in China, the government has committed genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. This did not go down well with the Chinese delegation at the UN. Indeed, the country's ambassador to the UN, Dai Bing, swiftly responded from the floor. "In an exceptional case," Ambassador Bing said, his American counterpart had actually admitted to her country's ignoble human rights record. And so, he said, that does not give her country the license to get on a high horse and tell other countries what to do. A similar note was struck around the same time at the first major America-China bilateral summit involving the new U.S. administration held in Alaska in March 2021. On that occasion, before the world's television cameras, Thomas Greenfield's boss, the new U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, briefly expressed to his Chinese counterparts his deep concerns over actions by China in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, and the country's economic coercion of allies. His Chinese counterpart, Yang Jieqi, was visibly furious. The United States had no right to lecture China, he explained, in an 18-minute harangue. "I think that we thought too well of the United States," Jieqi said. "The US does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength." Waving his hand angrily, dismissively at his counterpart, he continued, "There are many problems within the United States regarding human rights, and these are admitted by the US itself as well." While China was making progress on human rights, he said, the United States was not. "We hope the United States will do better on human rights." But, echoing the claims of the US's own ambassadors, Jieqi said that the challenges facing the United States in human rights are deep-seated. They did not just emerge over the past 4 years, such as Black Lives Matter. It did not come up only recently. Warning America not to interfere in China's internal affairs, Jieqi told Blinken that many Americans actually have little confidence in the democracy of the United States, and that America should look to its own problems instead of deflecting the blame on somebody else. The CCP's spokespeople now find this an enormously useful line of attack. In the summer of 2021, the UN Human Rights Council held a session in which developing countries denounced systemic racism and racial discrimination. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, said that denial of historical responsibility by countries that had benefited from the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism was an important cause of ongoing racism and racial violence. The CCP's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, told the international press that the developed world had to do more to tackle violence against people of African and Asian descent. And Zhao Lijian called on Western countries to address this problem, saying, "We urge relevant Western countries to earnestly respond to the concerns of the international community, deeply reflect on themselves, and take concrete measures to address the issue of systemic racism and racial discrimination, so as not only to promote and protect human rights at home, but also to contribute to the healthy development of the international human rights cause." Yet, while the CCP urges this introspection on the West, it engages in no such thing itself. In fact, at the same moment that it demands earnest responses to systemic racism and racial discrimination from the West, it engages in bellicose behavior of its own. In the very same month that it made this demand of the West, the CCP was commemorating its 100th anniversary. At a highly staged ceremony in Tiananmen Square before a crowd of tens of thousands of people, Xi Jinping declared that China's rise would prove to be a historical inevitability. He warned that the country would no longer be bullied, oppressed, or subjugated by foreign powers, and the language he used was characteristically martial. He declared that anyone who dares to try will find their heads bashed bloody against the great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people. The official English language translation softened this bloodthirsty language in an attempt to mislead the international media. But this is what Xi told the crowds in Beijing, which in itself is a characteristic example of CCP doublespeak. On my last visit to Tiananmen Square a decade ago, the English slogans being beamed out across the square were all peaceable. Those that were not translated but beamed out across the square in the local language included the slogan, "Long live socialism." There was only so much they wanted their international visitors to learn about them. But nothing about this is new. The CCP is only weaponizing Western weaknesses in the way that totalitarian regimes and competitors to the West have always operated. In Soviet Russia in 1936, Grigory Alexandrov and Isidor Simkov created one of the most popular films of the day. Circus was a tale of a white woman who has to flee her small-minded town in America, where the locals literally chase her out of town because she has given birth to an interracial baby with a father who is black. The woman runs away with the circus and ends up in Soviet Russia. While the Americans in the movie are portrayed throughout as bigoted and racist, the contrast with the great Soviet people could not be clearer. Indeed, when the heroine's shameful secret is exposed in front of an audience at the circus, the entire Russian audience protects the baby. The film ends with them singing a great lullaby to him, in which all the Soviet peoples are presented showing that they will protect this little black baby whom the American imperialists have cast out. Then everybody gathers together, holding the baby in their arms, to join in a great parade in honor of Comrade Stalin. There was nothing any noticeably less racist about Russia in the 1930s than there was in America, just as there is nothing less racist about China in the 2020s than there is in America. Very much the opposite. And yet it is enormously helpful to China today, as it was to the Soviets in the past, to encourage the perception of America as uniquely racist and China as uniquely virtuous. There are an endless number of reasons why Beijing does this today, as Moscow did in the past. It allows Beijing to get away with grotesque rights abuses of its own. It distracts Western attention. It suggests that the West has no moral legitimacy to act anywhere, and it runs off the claim that the West has not merely done things that every other civilization in history has done, but rather has always been worse than any other civilization, meaning that the West is uniquely unqualified to pass moral judgment today. This, in itself, relies on two fundamental presumptions, which both turn out to be true. First, it runs on the presumption that knowledge of Western history inside the West is uniquely lacking. Westerners have become increasingly unaware of what is true and what is not about their own past. Second, it runs on the presumption, again also true, that almost nobody in the West has any knowledge of what countries such as China have done throughout history or are doing today. In other words, the assault on the West's history succeeds because it speaks into a vacuum of vast historical and contemporary ignorance. It speaks to a populace inside the West as much as outside it, which is willing to see the whole of history through a single lens. If anything bad happens in the world, it must be the West's fault, because there is no other legitimate explanation of how things can go wrong other than explanations involving the West. Aside from the historical illiteracy of the anti-Westernism of our day, there is something else going on here. It is a gigantic moral presumption. That presumption is the idea that nobody in the world can do anything wrong unless the West has made them do it. A presumption that is quite outstandingly wrong. When Robert Mugabe came to power in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, in 1980, the average life expectancy in the country was just under 60. After his rule, or rather mismanagement of the country, for a little over a quarter of a century, the average life expectancy in Zimbabwe had almost halved. By 2006, the average Zimbabwean man could expect to live to 37. For women, life expectancy had fallen to 34. The situation got so bad that the average life expectancy for Zimbabwean women fell by 2 years in 2 years. Mugabe put his people on a treadmill that got shorter with every step. Similar stories played out across the world. 6 decades ago, Uganda was a net exporter of food, indeed one of the bread baskets of Africa. In the decades after colonization, it became a basket case, struggling even to feed its own people. Other countries, such as Egypt, have seen average wages fall lower since colonialism than during it, and that is not adjusting for inflation, but in simple practical salary terms. There are a number of explanations for situations like this, which can be replayed and repeated across Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. These explanations include gross mismanagement by post-colonial governments and grotesque corruption and self-enrichment by the governing class, who spent their years in office prioritizing the siphoning off of the nation's wealth to private bank accounts in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. On the other hand, there are countries that have been relative success stories. More than 7 decades after independence, India today is not just the world's most populous democracy, but one of the world's foremost economies. Although the age of empire lingers over these countries, in few does it remain the salient factor in whether a country has been able to succeed or fail. Some countries succeeded after independence. Some failed. Naturally, despots who have immiserated their own countries have a clear reason for blaming imperialism for all ills that currently beset their countries. But the only other group to join them in doing so are a portion of people in the West themselves. People who believe that the history of the world is a history of Western malfeasance and non-Western innocence. As well as being an insultingly partial history, it is also one that has absolutely no sense of global or historical perspective. And there is a reason for that. In order to be able to judge the West, you would have to know at least some of the history of the rest. The only thing modern Western populations are more ignorant about than their own history is the history of other peoples outside the West. Yet such knowledge is surely a prerequisite to being able to arrive at any moral judgments. A poll of young British people carried out by Survation in 2016 found that 50% had never heard of Lenin, while 70% had no idea who Mao was. Among 16 to 24-year-olds who had all grown up after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 41% had positive feelings about socialism, while just 28% felt the same sentiments towards capitalism. One possible reason for this is that 68% said that they had never learned anything in school about the Russian Revolution. Equal, if not greater, ignorance can be found in America. A poll carried out in 2020 found that almost 2/3 of Americans between the ages of 18 and 39 had no idea that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. According to the study, almost half of Americans in their 20s and 30s could not name a single concentration camp or ghetto established by the Nazis during World War II. About 1 in 8 young Americans, 12%, said that they had not heard of the Holocaust or didn't think that they had heard of it. And this is about the historical reference point that is most widely and perhaps overused in historical and present-day arguments about politics. It is worth keeping figures such as this in mind as we see the next manifestation of the war on the West, the assault on Western history. When people claim that populations are ignorant of the history of the West, they forget that most people are ignorant about almost everything. When critics claim that there is something sinister about their particular area of interest being too little known about, they forget that majorities of young people across the West have no serious knowledge even of one of the greatest crimes in history. So this is a delicate as well as a sinister moment, because when you are speaking into a great vacuum of ignorance, people with malign intent can run an awfully long way, awfully fast. They can tell their listeners things that they will simply believe and tell them what they should not question. And as you speak into a vacuum of knowledge, you can, if you are so ideologically inclined, completely rewrite the history of the West, divorcing it from any proper understanding and certainly from any wider context, all in the hope of persuading the peoples of the West not that they were better than anyone else or that they were the same as anyone else, but that they were uniquely evil and therefore worse than everyone else, that the history of the West is especially shameful. This is the chief reason that within the course of only a couple of generations, the history of the West has been entirely rewritten, and rewritten in order to tell the people of the West that their history is not especially glorious, but instead a source of unimaginable shame. The anti-Western revisionists have been out in force in recent years. It is high time that we revise them in turn. Chapter 2. History. In her racist speech at Yale in 2021, Dr. Aruna Kilanani made many extraordinary claims, and in an interview around the same time, she made many more. Here is one of the things she told Katie Herzog. People of colour, myself included, suffer from being positioned in the world psychologically, and the stuff that goes with it, violence, this, that. Now, white people suffer from problems of their own mind. They suffer with trust, they suffer with intimacy, they suffer with closeness, shame, guilt, anxiety. They suffer with their minds. Don't get me wrong, people of colour are also neurotic and have their own stuff and ups and downs, but there is a fundamental issue, I think, that is very unique to white suffering, and I think that's their own mind. Katie Herzog. What would you say is the cause of this? Kulanani. I think it's colonialism. That history. If you do this much lying to yourself, it's going to have an effect on your mind. There's no way it can't. That may be a characteristically extreme way of putting it, but it is not rare to see someone claim that in all of human history there is something especially evil about white people. In recent years, it has become entirely commonplace to claim that white people are somehow deranged by their history. And it is an interesting move for critics of the West to make, because it demonstrates a need to overturn what such critics see as the mainstream currents of history teaching in the West. These critics have an extraordinary view of what is taught in schools across the West. They believe that young people today are taught one-sided jingoism and nationalistic propaganda. They believe that people in the West are uniquely ignorant of their own history, and uniquely ignorant of other people's too. They believe that we have spent the last generation covering over the dark parts of our past. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. For instance, it is the constant assertion of race activists in the United Kingdom that British school children are ignorant about the legacy of empire in their schools. The claim is demonstrably wrong. The national curriculum in England and Wales dictates teaching for primary and secondary school pupils in the United Kingdom. The study of the British Empire is a statutory area of study for Key Stage 3. Non-statutory areas of study include the transatlantic slave trade and Indian independence. And while critics sometimes claim that the fact that these areas are non-statutory means that they are deemed unimportant or somehow hidden, the claim is nonsense. Other areas of non-statutory study in English schools include the Magna Carta, the War of the Roses, the Enlightenment, and both World Wars. In fact, school children in England have as much education in the history of empire as they do in 1066. And when they get to choose which famous people from history to study at Key Stage 1, the handful of suggested figures include Mary Seacole and Rosa Parks. It is the same in America. It is asserted constantly that Americans are ignorant of the history of slavery. Nothing could be further from the truth. I have gone through all the advanced placement exams used in high schools in the United States in recent years. That is, the history exam used at the end of high school. In these exams, issues to do with slavery, colonialism, race, and other related rights issues constitute around half of all the subjects that are tested. Out of 48 questions in the 2021 AP exam, 8 dealt exclusively with racial issues, another 4 with related racial issues, and another 4 with economic matters from a point of view that is familiar with anyone who understands a Marxist critique of capitalism. The questions covered every major race-related issue in American history, from the arrival of the colonists to Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and the effects of racism in the present day. In spite of the fact that school children in the West are brought up on a diet of the sins of their forefathers.